Нет. Бедадину. Бедадинность мысли. Они такие круглые все. А что, кипяток какой-нибудь, что ли? Я себе говорю, ушел, сучали есть, ушел не несет. Ну, блин.
Am I boring you? Don't set this tale aside. Give me just a few minutes more, for someone special's about to appear in dire straits upon a scaffold. It gets good. Eventually. That's a phrase I'm sure you've heard more than once, right? The Witcher 2 is great, but only after you've slogged your way through its 20-hour introduction full of bad combat and boring exposition. Metal Gear Solid 5, now that's a really interesting game, so long as you don't mind crawling very slowly through a hospital altogether. And Dota is one of the finest multiplayer games ever made, but you do have to play about 100 games just to understand what's going on. I've lost track of the number of books, TV shows and games that have been recommended to me over the years that came with that caveat. Oh, it starts off a bit slow, but if you stick with it, it gets really good, I promise. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a grave injustice. So many otherwise fantastic titles turn potential audiences away because they have boring introductions or openings that don't properly communicate what they've really got to offer, meaning people never get around to experiencing them at all. A recent example of this that I've run into is the game Xenoblade Chronicles 2, an RPG that I and many other people bounced off of completely. Not because the game is bad, I actually think Xenoblade 2 is really quite good, but because the game's introduction utterly failed to grab me. Were it not for me going back and really forcing myself to power through the game's opening hours, I would have completely dismissed it forever, rather than celebrating Xenoblade 2 as the diamond in the rough that it actually is. I'll be getting back to Xenoblade 2 later, mark my words, but it isn't alone here. It feels like a really good introduction to games is becoming rarer as time goes on, and a more pronounced issue as games get longer and more complex every year. Playing virtually any open-worldy Ubisoft-style game requires you to wait for it to stop throwing systems and objectives at you before you can actually start exploring, and most survival games necessitate playing with the wiki open for your first few hours just to understand what the hell you're supposed to be doing. I think a lot of this problem comes from how we talk about and think about gaming introductions. We in the gaming space tend to reduce intros to that boring bit at the start that tells you which button to press to make the gun go shoot and which button you press to pet the dog. While this is technically to make the gun go shoot and which button you press to pet the dog. While this is technically true, introductions are also so much more than that. They're a pitch for the entire experience, and by making good ones, games can avoid that seemingly constant problem of being boring until you've already played them a lot, and also let games show themselves off completely during your first play session, rather than your fifth. To do this, a game needs to achieve two very important objectives in its opening moments if it wants its audience to stand a hope of sticking around to the end. Firstly, it needs to educate, by filling the audience in not just on how to play, but what to expect out of the rest of the game. For example, Hollow Knight's first zone, The King's Path, teaches you the controls and basic gameplay concepts. However, it's not until the second, The Forgotten Crossroads, the players learn how the game actually works. The Crossroads are responsible for communicating the general vibe of Hallownest as a setting, as well as helping players get to grips with the main Metroidvania gameplay loop of exploration, fighting bosses, and gaining new abilities that let them explore new areas. Only after the Forgotten Crossroads does the game really start to let players off the leash, and it's not until the end of the fight with Hornet in the Green Path that the real game actually gets started. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Architect of Games, you beautiful monster from the video game dimension. That's just a tutorial. What are you talking about? Well, I actually argue that a good tutorial is only one half of a good introduction. See, not only do introductions need to educate, they also need to entice, or in other non-alliterative words, convince players to keep playing even after their initial curiosity has worn off. In Horizon Zero Dawn, right when you're let out of the tutorial zone during the quest Secret of the Gates, you're also introduced to two very interesting ideas you're going to want to follow up on. First, that these scary machines have shown up and are turning other machines red, and thus evil, as well as the brand new ability to mind control machines for yourself, opening up a bunch of new gameplay options. Both of these things present interesting possibilities for players to go and explore now that the full game is open to them, kickstarting their real adventure off with some nice early momentum for both narratively and mechanically minded players. If an introduction fails to educate a player,
людей. Страшно это, да? Ну, да. Как я так все осталось? Нет, как это осталось? Чем это все? Дайте надо. Дальше сразу же все. Правильно? Слышал вокруг таких штучек, которые нет, нужно положить. Все старое.
They won't understand what's going on and will be unable to fully appreciate what a game has to offer. And if a player isn't sufficiently enticed, then they'll either stop paying attention and caring about what's going on, or even worse, stop playing entirely. To understand how great introductions achieve both of these goals, let's look at them both in more detail. First, education, because that's the one that's probably more obvious from a player's perspective. Making a great tutorial is a subject that you could devote a whole video to, and many clever people, as well as some less clever people, have done just that. But in the context of a good introduction, a tutorial has one function: to transition players from passive learning, that being through instruction, to active learning, or learning through experimentation and play as quickly and effectively as possible. Nobody likes being sat down and told what buttons to press, but sometimes it's just unavoidable for more complex games. However, that doesn't mean the tutorials always have to be boring and take ages. Bayonetta efficiently uses its flashy opening segment both as a lordom and a consequence-free training ground to teach players the basics of moving and attacking in a safe environment. And the tutorials of 4X games like Civilization don't even bother to mention stuff like spying, World Congress, or electricity because they don't appear until late into the game. And by the time players get to endgame, they'll already have the skills needed to intuitively understand these concepts all on their own. The mechanics of play aren't the only thing a game's introduction can teach, however. It's just as important for an intro to convey the vibe and tone of a game, putting players into the right frame of mind to get the most out of a game as possible. Failing to do this can result in a crucial disconnect that can poison the entire experience. In No Man's Sky, for example, the game makes a big deal out of its survival mechanics and the feel of battling the elements in its opening hour or so, but these systems are rendered all but irrelevant once you've got your spaceship up and running, immediately turning away players who wanted an exploration-focused game, whilst also disappointing those who actually like the feel of surviving in a harsh wilderness. On the other hand, when a game sets the tone well in its introduction, it can transform the way you play for the better and communicate its narrative aesthetic significantly better than a million audio logs ever could. For example, XCOM Enemy Unknown, yes, I finally get to talk about XCOM again, is absolutely genius in the way that it normalizes death and failure to prevent the game's sometimes punitive difficulty from turning players away and gets them invested in the fight against the aliens. See, in the tutorial, things start off as you'd expect, with the basics of movement and cover, but when you get into your first actual fight, rather than a pushover skirmish you might be expecting, it's instead an absolute bloodbath, and the fight is scripted such that only one of your 4 soldiers can escape alive. This immediately puts the player on the back foot and makes their inevitable future deaths feel much less punishing, because rather than feeling like a draconian punishment for messing up, death has been communicated from the start to be an expected part of gameplay. But that's not all. Not only is XCOM about fighting against a vastly more powerful enemy force, it's also about learning from their tactics and eventually getting revenge. That's why the lone tutorial survivor is guaranteed to immediately promote into a heavy weapons specialist, meaning that when you bring them to the first real mission of the game, you get to get your own back on those filthy sectoids by going to town with a sweet rocket launcher that can annihilate entire packs of enemies in one go, cementing the game's fundamental gameplay loop. This ever-increasing arms race between you and the aliens, with both sides fighting dirty and taking heavy losses along the way. Making an effective intro to a video game is much harder than it is for almost any other medium. Not only are they on average orders of magnitude more complex from a technical perspective, video games have the added disadvantage of usually being played over multiple sessions and require the player's active input in order to work at all. Citizen Kane never asks you to stop and do a couple of quick time events to get really sad about a sled you used to own that represents your last moments of childhood innocence, because it's just kind of on the screen. So it doesn't really matter if you're not 100% getting it, because the movie is going to continue anyway, and you're not expected to come back once it's all over. Because video games are so reliant on the player's effort and enthusiasm though, it's more important than ever to get them to come back and play some more after what can often be one of the least exciting parts of a game, The introduction. The easiest and most consistent way to ensure a player's investment and long-term interest in what's going on is to create what's known in the biz as a hook. Because, it hooks someone in. A hook usually takes the form of some sort of unanswered question or interesting possibility that invites the audience to stick around to find out what the answer is. Wow, that ring certainly looks interesting. Wonder when that's going to turn up. What's the deal with this cynically marketable character? Hell, at the start of most of Shakespeare's plays, someone stands up and tells everyone the ending. Not as a spoiler, but to get them much harder than it is for almost any other medium. Difficulty from turning players away and gets them invested in the fight against the aliens. See, in the tutorial, things start off as you'd expect. Such that up and make, but that's not all. Well, go, cementing the game's fundamental gameplay loop of this ever-increasing arms race between you and the aliens, with both sides fighting dirty and taking heavy losses along the way. Making an effective intro to a video game is much harder than it is for almost any other medium. Not only are they on average orders of magnitude more complex from a technical perspective, video games have the added disadvantage of usually being played over multiple sessions and require the player's active input in order to work at all. Citizen Kane never asks you to stop and do a couple of quick time events to get really sad about a sled you used to own that represents your last moments of childhood innocence, because it's just kind of on the screen. So it doesn't really matter if you're not 100% getting it, because the movie is going to continue anyway, and you're not expected to come back once it's all over. Because video games are so reliant on the player's effort and enthusiasm though, it's more important than ever to get them to come back and play some more after what can often be one of the least exciting parts of a game. The introduction. The easiest and most consistent way to ensure a player's investment and long-term interest in what's going on is to create what's known in the biz as a hook. Because, it hooks someone in. A hook usually takes the form of some sort of unanswered question or interesting possibility that invites the audience to stick around to find out what the answer is. Wow, that ring certainly looks interesting. Wonder when that's going to turn up. What's the deal with this cynically marketable character? Hell, at the start of most of Shakespeare's plays, someone stands up and tells everyone the ending. Not as a spoiler, but to get them wondering about how that happened and eager to find out via the rest of the performance. Video games are no different. In order to hook players in, they need to create some sort of long-term question in a player's mind relating to the game's narrative, its mechanical possibilities, or ideally both. For example, Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild is smartly designed so as to show off all of its most interesting mechanics, that being the physics system, fire and Sheikah state abilities during the opening, leaving the player to wonder about all the cool potential applications they'll have once the game lets them off the break plateau. And Ring of Pain reeled me in, not only with its incredibly creepy aesthetic and its surreal dreamlike setting containing a horrible monster owl, but also the really unique take on dungeon crawling that comes from all the levels being rings. To go a little bit more in depth, let's revisit our good friend Xenoblade Chronicles 2, as well as its older, more successful brother, Xenoblade Chronicles 1, to illustrate why good hooks are so important. Xenoblade 1 engages players on a mechanical and narrative level right from the outset. For example, from almost the very beginning of the game, you have access to the status effects Break, Topple, and Daze, which form part of a chain. These statuses correspond to each of your three starting characters. Shulk is an aggressive supporter, and so he can use Break, which makes enemies more vulnerable to status effects. Rhyne, the tank of the team, can topple, crowd-controlling enemies by briefly immobilizing them, and Fiora, the starting trio's damage dealer, can daze, causing enemies to forget who damaged them the most and not attack your squishy damage dealer. Topple, crowd-controlling enemies by briefly immobilizing them. Effects. Rhyne, the tank of the team, can topple, controlling enemies by briefly immobilizing them, and Fiora, the starting trio's damage dealer, can daze, causing enemies to forget who damaged them the most and not attack your squishy damage dealers, of which Fiora, causing enemies to forget who damaged them the most and not attack your squishy damage dealers, of which Fiora is the squishiest. This combo adds a great dimension to fights on top of your regular positioning, damage and healing concerns, and even has unique applications against particular enemies. Damage and healing concerns. This combo adds a great dimension to fights on top of your regular positioning, damage and healing concerns, and even has unique applications against particular enemies. Armored and Mechon, the main baddies, could normally only be damaged when toppled or dazed, so you've got to build up the combo that unleash all of your moves at once in one big burst. Chain attacks which let you freeze time and combo moves together, as well as Shulk's super powerful Bernardo arts once he gets his hands on it, also add a lot of combat depth as you unlock more moves and character combinations. In essence, Xenoblade 1 throws all of its most interesting mechanics at players right from the get-go, and slowly expands upon them as the game goes on to keep players interested. This is from the game. And slowly expands upon them as the game goes on to keep players interested. This is a philosophy that extends to its story. Small spoiler warning for the intro of Xenoblade 1. It happens very early in the game, but it is very important to the plot, so skip here if you'd like to avoid it. Use your own judgment. About 90 minutes into the game, the hub town of Colony 9 gets invaded by those Mechon I mentioned earlier, and after a cool showdown with this big mean motherfucker, Fiora gets murdered. Yep. She's just dead. She's gone. What it took Final Fantasy VII half a game to build up to, Xenoblade Chronicles does in the tutorial. Fiora's death at the hands of Metalface is the catalyst for the entire story, and is pretty emotional, with players really looking forward to getting revenge on the Mechon. Even mechanically minded players will be sad that they no longer have a dedicated day specialist and won't get a new one until the 7th and final party member about 2/3 of the way through the game. By putting its best foot forwards at all times and using hooks aggressively, Xenoblade Chronicles 1 creates some fantastic starting momentum that can carry players all the way through till the end of the game. Xenoblade 2, on the other hand, does almost none of this. Let's start with the mechanics, shall we? Unlike its predecessor, Xenoblade 2 is a much more complicated game, and the game wisely locks off some of its more complicated mechanics to avoid overwhelming new players. Unfortunately, the game cuts out too much, forcing you to spend the first few hours of the game watching Rex slowly auto-attack lobsters to death and occasionally getting to use an ability. Instead of allowing players to get into the fun stuff right away, Xenoblade 2 leads with its weakest mechanics, like the poorly explained and badly balanced pouch items and the mind-bogglingly stupid gacha mechanic for acquiring new party members. Why this is in a single-player game, I will never know. The break topple combo and chain attacks are both actually in Xenoblade 2, and are much more nuanced this time around. The problem is, you can't really access any of the interesting combat stuff until you're about 1/3 of the way through the game, which is just too much of a time commitment if you're asking players to play upwards of 15 hours. I consider myself a fan of RPGs. I've played all the big ones from be tested. One of the most important things that great devs keep in mind when designing For example, in Final Fantasy XV, powerful Imperial robots are and expand what players get up to outside of them. In other words, to add additional layers to the game. Fire Emblem is probably the earliest innovator in this department, adding a tactical layer to traditional RPG mechanics. The beauty of Fire Emblem is that its combat mechanics are dead simple. But because you're commanding 12 or so characters at a time, each with different movement ranges, strengths and weaknesses, battles can take on a much more strategic element as you're forced to contend with winning lengthy missions rather than individual battles. In addition, permadeath encourages investing into a few powerful characters, leading to interesting choices as to which ones will end up being force-fed experience points and which characters will sit on the bench forever. For the King does the same sort of thing, except it simulates an entire game world that each character has to run around in between getting into scraps. In For the King, not only do you have to concentrate on gearing up and fighting monsters like in any other RPG, but you also have to manage moving between fights efficiently and keeping tabs on the rising forces of chaos springing up around the map, testing both your logistical skills as well as your tactical ones. Wasting time on the board means that enemies will get tougher, but powering ahead into dungeons while your teammates are off killing bonk skellies is more often than not going to result in losing one of your precious lives. Adding long-term strategic consequences and decisions to battles can help tie them together and make them feel like a single contiguous narrative rather than isolated episodes. Whilst leveling up characters can do this to some extent, it's pretty hard to relate to numbers alone. This is why Pokemon encourages you to catch them all, why Path of Exile makes you fill out that big scary skill tree, and why games like Darkest Dungeon instead love giving characters randomly generated traumas. In Double D, characters begin as blank slates, but slowly develop a personality through the quirks they acquire. Chumps that accidentally get trapped in an Iron Maiden might become claustrophobic, others might be compulsive thieves, and all of these little statuses are accompanied with their own small dialogue snippets and in-battle consequences, really helping the otherwise anonymous characters to establish a memorable identity you can get attached to as you play, making their inevitable deaths that much more gut-wrenching. Branching narrative paths, morality and reputation systems pioneered by Western CRPGs around the same time Japan was getting really into strategy have the same effect of tying gameplay and narrative together. Because for many people the main draw of an RPG is the story, they might not want to focus too much on the fighting, but when bashing goblins has knock-on narrative consequences, and when your choices in the story determine how powerful your characters are, players can suddenly become invested in both, regardless of their initial preference. Many games of the Fallout or Planescape Torment persuasion can even determine which characters get added to your party through your narrative actions, changing not just which enemies you fight, but how you fight them. Boom the Sniper in Fallout New Vegas hates Caesar's Legion, and once you've proven that you do too, he gives you a special perk that highlights enemies when you zoom in. This is incredibly useful for sneaking up on camps full of Legion guys with long-range weapons, because they typically fight in melee and have good armor that needs a sniper to punch through it, neatly tying together different layers of gameplay, evocative enemy design, and simple but nuanced abilities. By combining all three of these ideas, developers can make combat systems compelling enough to last through 100-hour campaigns, even if the nuts and bolts suck, like in Fallout New Vegas. By focusing on making the combat more satisfying, more interesting, and with greater scope, the RPG is continuing to evolve. The Final Fantasy VII Remake takes the epic masterpiece that is the original and gives the combat a much-needed overhaul to make it less of a slog without losing the cinematic feel. Random encounters, which originated as a result of hardware limitations, are slowly but surely slipping into the dumpster of history where they belong, and terrible old-school morality systems rip the Fantasy VII Remake. Developers can make combat systems compelling enough to last through 100-hour campaigns, even if the nuts and bolts suck, like he gives you a special perk that highlights enemies when you zoom in. This is incredibly useful for sneaking up on camps full of Legion guys with long-range weapons, because they typically fight in melee and have good armor that needs a sniper to punch through it, neatly tying together different layers of gameplay, evocative enemy design, and simple but nuanced abilities. By combining all three of these ideas, developers can make combat systems compelling enough to last through 100-hour campaigns, even if the nuts and bolts suck, like in Fallout New Vegas. By focusing on making the combat more satisfying, more interesting, and with greater scope, the RPG is continuing to evolve. The Final Fantasy VII Remake takes the epic masterpiece that is the original and gives the combat a much-needed overhaul to make it less of a slog without losing the cinematic feel. Random encounters, which originated as a result of hardware limitations, are slowly but surely slipping into the dumpster of history where they belong, and terrible old-school morality systems ripped straight from D&D are being phased out and replaced with much more nuanced player choice and narrative consequences. So, why is it then that I've played about 60 hours of Divinity Original Sin 2, about 40 of Final Fantasy 15, and apparently over 300 of Fallout New Vegas, and I've still not completed any of them? Why? It's clear from how much I genuinely like the combat in all of these games. Yes, even you Fallout New Vegas, RPGs have more ways to evolve than just modernizing the ways they handle fighting. RPGs shouldn't feel constrained by the need to have 40-hour stories or having combat at all. Barclay, Shut Up and Jack Gaiden, the Shadowrun RPGs and South Park The Stick of Truth all clock in at under 10 hours, meaning that all of their great writing is nicely condensed into an easily digestible package, and the pretty straightforward fighting never outstays its welcome. Similarly, great games like Persona 5 or Nier Automata are free to really let their narrative breathe and tell their story slowly because they know their combat is good enough to carry it. Some newer RPGs don't have any combat, and they're stronger for it. Disco Elysium, my favourite game of last year, does exactly this, cutting out combat to zero in on the internal struggle of its main character. By using a fresh perspective on leveling up and growing stronger to represent your character forming an identity and ideological framework for himself, Disco Elysium tells a completely different kind of story within a tradition that's been around for decades. And this is only possible without the distraction of worrying about DPS, mana, or whether to spec Kim into healing, or whether to use his SAS abilities to turn him into an emotional damage dealer. Combat in role-playing games can be the focus of an experience designed around rich and satisfying tactics, but that doesn't mean you also have to include a story about teenagers killing God. An RPG with a globe-trotting tale of adventure at its core doesn't always need a legion of gobos to kill along the way, and of course a much-needed overhaul to make it less of a slog without losing the cinematic feel. Random encounters, which originated as a result of old-school morality systems ripped straight from D&D, are being phased out and replaced with much more nuanced player choice and narrative consequences. So, why is it then that I've played about 60 hours of Divinity Original Sin 2, about 40 of Final Fantasy 15, and apparently over 300 of Fallout New Vegas, and I've still not completed any of them? Why? It's clear from how much I genuinely like the combat in all of these games. Yes, even you Fallout New Vegas. RPGs have more ways to evolve than just modernizing the ways they handle fighting. RPGs shouldn't feel constrained by the need to have 40-hour stories or having combat at all. Barclay, Shut Up and Jack Gaiden, the Shadowrun RPGs and South Park The Stick of Truth all clock in at under 10 hours, meaning that all of their great writing is nicely condensed into an easily digestible package, and the pretty straightforward fighting never outstays its welcome. Similarly, great games like Persona 5 or Nier Automata are free to really let their narrative breathe and tell their story slowly because they know their combat is good enough to carry it. Some newer RPGs don't have any combat, and they're stronger for it. Disco Elysium, my favourite game of last year, does exactly this, cutting out combat to zero in on the internal struggle of its main character. By using a fresh perspective on leveling up and growing stronger to represent your character forming an identity and ideological framework for himself, Disco Elysium tells a completely different kind of story within a tradition that's been around for decades, and this is only possible without the distraction of worrying about DPS, mana, or whether to spec Kim into healing, or whether to use his SAS abilities to turn him into an emotional damage dealer. Combat in role-playing games can be the focus of an experience designed around rich and satisfying tactics, but that doesn't mean you also have to include a story about teenagers killing God. An RPG with a globe-trotting tale of adventure at its core doesn't always need a legion of gobos to kill along the way, and of course it's perfectly fine to balance the two into a package that rewards thinking deeply about combat and narrative, so long as you ensure that one never drags the other down. The classic style of RPG isn't going anywhere, but I think it could stand to be modernised and innovated upon too. Maybe then, I could actually finish one. But I think we can all agree that the one that RPG trope that should stick around forever is the grand tradition of that one weirdly hypersexualised character. Whether it's Miranda or Morrigan, queens of the daddy and mummy issues respectively from the BioWare Golden Age, Camilla from Fire Emblem Fates, who constantly goes on about how she wants to bang her sibling, Madame Flurry from the Thousand Year Door, who's some sort of sexy cloud lady, and of course, Sexy Lady Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. And if I'm being honest, Sexy Boy Cloud as well. Sorry, what was I talking about? I got a bit distracted. Hello and welcome back. I took a bit of a break after the From Fractions video to recharge because I knew this was going to be a long one, and it turns out I was right. I also lost a bunch of my footage, so that's why most of the stuff you can see from these games is from near the start, but I'm going to say that's me trying to avoid spoilers. If you'd like to check out someone who isn't me, and is also one of the cleverest minds in the talking about video games on YouTube space, then please check out Noah Gervais. All his videos are just wall-to-wall awesome analysis delivered in a way that's simultaneously rambling as hell, yet also super engaging. I highly recommend his stuff on Doom and Kentucky Route Zero in particular. But if you'd like to support more of me, then please do chuck me some money on Patreon. If you give me even $1 for 1 month, you have my perpetual permission to use Adblock on the channel because you'll be worth more money to me that way.
Мне удалось получить востребованную профессию Android-разработчика и интересную работу, которая мне нравится. Это новый этап в моей карьере и жизни.
Progression systems are in just about everything these days. They're in racing games, they're in battle royales, and they're even in RTS like StarCraft. Over the last 10 or so years, levels, gear, experience, and character customization have burst out of RPGs and can now be found in virtually every major genre around the day. A game having some sort of progression system isn't really a selling point anymore. These sorts of mechanics are expected on a AAA design nowadays, and there's an old saying, it takes two to tango. Now, that's a phrase usually reserved for Argentinian dancing, or probably an advertisement for orange-flavoured soft drinks, but it can also be applied to video games, in particular, enemy design. Since the days of Space Invaders, enemies have served a single, simple purpose: to create a challenge for the player that they can overcome, and in doing so, have fun. But it's not quite that straightforward, is it? Simply challenging the player is easy, but challenging them in a compelling, interesting way? That is much harder. Engineering the perfect enemy requires mastering concepts that are really quite difficult to put into words, and I've spent ages trying to get my head around what separates an all-time great bad guy like Bioshock's Big Daddies, Mario's Goombas, or Crow's Mimics from one that's merely good. So, what I've done is outline 4 fundamental characteristics I think most good enemies share as a way to figure out not only what that special secret enemy design ingredient is, but why particular favourite bad guys work so well, and why some just don't. Let's get started with the first characteristic, and that is the idea of an appropriate difficulty. Note that I didn't say that good enemies have to be hard, because they don't. What is important is that enemies have a level of difficulty that reflects the kind of experience they're supposed to create. It's perfectly okay that these cultists will simply run around in the early stages of dusk for easy to kill and don't do much damage, because at that point in the game, most of it reflects the kind of experience they're supposed to create. It's perfectly okay that these cultists will simply run around in the early stages of dusk for easy to kill and don't do much damage, because at that point in the game, most of the challenge is in developing the muscle memory and shooting skills you'll need to survive in any good-looking shooter. And so, once the difficulty ramps up in chapters 2 and 3, these enemies will be phased out and replaced with harder and harder variants that feel fair because you've mastered the skills needed to take them on. Of course, easy enemies still have their place, even in sections of a game that are meant to be harder. They can be a great way to ramp up or cool down the level of tension, or to give players a few crucial feel-good power trips to stop the difficulty getting too aggressive. On the flip side, really tricky enemies way above the normal difficulty curve can be a great challenge for experienced players that recreates the thrill of the first time playthrough, as well as a way to give new players a nice grudge to pursue. Black Knights in Dark Souls, Hide Knights in Dark Souls 2, and a bunch of different enemies like these one-off demons in Dark Souls 3 are completely optional fights that guard rare treasure or quest objectives. Most first-timers will usually try these fights a few times, but get distracted by the comparatively easier foes on the critical path. But for players who want a challenge, these guys help to break up the monotony of playing through areas you've already mastered by sticking you with an additional challenge that's tough for even real-life MLG Dark Souls pro gamers like myself. That's not even mentioning how really hard enemies can be a great way to teach players a lesson. Risk of Rain's gradually advancing timer begins to spawn tougher and tougher baddies as time goes on, eventually going so far as to spawn packs of bosses as if they're enemies. Naturally, these are way too hard for someone who doesn't know what they're doing, and the looming threat of these big, scary creatures keeps players pushing forward into the next level where they can get better stuff, rather than encouraging them to waste time scouring every level for all its loot before moving on, because that's a really boring way to play. Difficulty is by no means the only part of a good enemy though, because enemies need to oppose the player in a way that's actually interesting, and the best way to do that is to make them specific. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that a specific enemy is one that has a distinct identity. It has strengths, weaknesses, and abilities that are unique and set it apart from everything else in the game. Take a look at the best chapter in Half-Life 2, Guido goes to Rosenheim. This level, which is a zombie-infested town, uses 3 different breeds of bad guys to provide the player with 3 different experiences. Regular zombies are easy to hit with stuff like sword blades, they come in large numbers and can quickly overwhelm you if you get distracted. Fast zombies are much more aggressive, and panic you when you're in tight quarters, but don't actually do that much damage or have very much health. And poison zombies throw poison headshots. horrible little bastards that can make you very vulnerable by temporarily reducing your health to 1, but they're slow and make a telltale clicking noise when there's about to strike. By really leaning into what makes these enemies special, they can be used to create fantastic, memorable experiences like a rooftop duel against a horde of fasties or a back alley infested with poison headground explosion. These designs are much more interesting than just having 3 boring variations on the same template with 1 different stats. A lack of specificity, God I hate saying that word, is why Call of Duty's many flavors of shooting guns are way less compelling than, say, Titanfall 2 selections, such as picks that explode, robots that don't mind losing limbs, and shield guys you need to flank. In For the King, a fun little roguelike JRPG, each enemy has its own signature attack, like these rat thieves who can steal from you that run away, or these brilliantly spooky rock and roll skeletons who can cancel your moves by distracting you. Even these small, unique twists can help fights to feel memorable and fresh, as you have to switch up your tactics in every fight to deal with these distinctive enemies and their distinctive weaknesses. Like the fact that the big boss bard skeleton, the Royal Troll, is really reliant on his backup bats and buffs, and so is much weaker once they're dead. The specific enemies don't even have to be based around mechanics. They can even be based around getting the player to think or feel in a particular way. In Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, these fast-moving teleporting boys are a real pain to deal with early on, and can leave you feeling paranoid and stressed as they menacingly circle around you, dodging your attacks and chipping away at your health. But as you get better at the game and can master the focus ability, you can stun them and take advantage of their low health. A triumph which reflects Senua's journey to try and master her psychosis. While specific enemies are great for giving players unique and varied experiences, that great design isn't going to be anything if players don't know what kind of experience they should be having and how to engage with their foes. And how to do that, well, you've got to give them a personality. Giving an enemy a personality is a little bit more than sticking a pair of googly eyes on something and calling it a day. Everything from the way an enemy looks to how it responds to a player's actions informs the way they feel about it and influences the way they'll engage with it in the future. Let's start with something that makes it easy to illustrate what I'm talking about. Cowardly enemies. Peeps that are either scared of you or run away when they spot you. These guys are a bit of a game design trope, and with good reason. Because your first instinct when seeing an enemy that wants to get away from you is to not give it that chance, prompting a little mini chase scene and immediately establishing a relationship between you and them. Because players naturally want to chase cowardly enemies, giving them a big sack of loot or something shiny to grab is also a great way to further catch the player's eye and encourage this behaviour. We can see this in the form of these moneybag enemies in Mario 64, as well as the baby crystal lizards in Dark Souls, who players naturally get trained to spot because of all the cool stuff they carry. The same is true for enemies who actually defend themselves. Before a player has ever even interacted with an enemy, all they know about it comes from their observation. Therefore, it's important to use an enemy's design to communicate what it does and how it acts as clearly as possible. Deadly, long-ranged enemies like Guardians from The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, or literally anything wielding a sniper rifle, usually have these big, dumb, nonsensical laser sights that totally give them away. Although this, admittedly, isn't very realistic, it subconsciously communicates to players that the fun in this encounter comes from staying out of sight and closing the distance without getting shot, but also because getting sniped out of nowhere isn't very much fun. When it comes to the visual design of enemies, exaggerating important features is usually the right way to go. If an enemy explodes, cover it with something like big, inflating pustules, and if you don't want players to jump on something, cover it in spikes, which are universal game design shorthand. For aggressive foes that charge into battle, give them qualities that instill this idea in the player. For example, big bull's horns or a massive battering ram arm like the chargers from Left 4 Dead. It's fine to keep stuff like how to actually beat a puzzle-based enemy, or some cool niche interactions for players to discover, but people always need to know how to at least approach an enemy, otherwise they're not going to know what to do, and will miss out on all the cool design that went into them. Having enemies with a clear, focused design is a great foundation upon which to build an iconic bad guy, but it's not enough. A great enemy also needs to fit into the wider ecosystem of play, whether that's working alongside other enemies, the environment, or even the player. In other words, a good enemy is synergistic. Take Halo, a game with great specific enemies that all do a particular job and very clear visual design that's elevated to iconic status by the way all of its relatively simple enemies interact with each other to create a bunch of great immersion scenarios that continue to challenge players in new and inventive ways. The most obvious example is in the strange relationship between grunts, these little jerks, and elites, these big guys. Under normal circumstances, grunts will run away from you if you try and close the distance, because any melee attack will kill them instantly. However, if an elite is present, they won't. Instead, grunts will run right at you and get in your face, but you're trying to deal with more important enemies. Of course, killing their elite boss will cause the pack of grunts to scatter like the little cowards they are, until they find a new elite to team up with. This relatively simple set of rules and interactions creates a brilliant back and forth between the players and the enemies, but interacting with them isn't just a one-way relationship, but they'll actually respond to your actions, causing you to have to shift tactics even in the middle of an encounter. Most platformers as well are great at combining disparate elements together to create new interactions, like this great elevator level in Rayman Legends that combines sentries and these weird Splinter Cell frogs to make an awesome action movie fight scene. Or how Mario Maker lets you stack enemies on top of each other to create Frankenstein hybrid bad guys. And before you go telling me that Frankenstein was the Doctor, think about this. Wasn't he, and by extension humanity's fear of otherness, the real monster? Yeah. I've read a book. Synergistic enemies don't always have to be working against you. A lot of the time, enemies can be used as tools. In Into the Breach, an intermediate player that's gone to grips with how each of the individual Vex species works will figure out that often these giant space bugs themselves are more
Кто это у нас тут, это самое? Это робот.